In Iowa's second-largest community, a collection of structures tell a story dating back more than a century. Join Iowa PBS as we journey inside the historic buildings of the City of Five Seasons, Cedar Rapids. Stories of culture, history, and grandeur, intertwined with the structures that still remain. A towering icon honoring veterans, adorned with a golden flame, the Veterans Memorial Building rests on an island in the Cedar River. Its Great Hall, a gathering place for generations resting near a towering, stained glass work of art. An historic mansion with a multi-generational story tracing from the railroads to meatpacking to steel and iron. Brucemore Mansion rests among 26 serene acres and houses stories stretching from lions to love to preservation. A legendary theater rebuilt to its original glory, even after it was ravaged by floodwaters. The Paramount Theater in downtown Cedar Rapids began as a 1920s showcase for traveling performers, then a grand movie theater, before its rebirth as an ambassador for the arts. A museum chronicling rich immigrant heritage as the community's Czech village embraces an ethos of struggle, determination, and triumph. The hometown work of an iconic American artist, as Grant Wood's legacy and workplace are embedded alongside the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and an historic Louis Sullivan Bank finding new purposes in the 21st century. Join us for an unparalleled tour of awe-inspiring art and architecture. Historic Buildings of Iowa, Cedar Rapids.
Funding for Historic Buildings of Iowa, Cedar Rapids is provided by Friends, the Iowa PBS Foundation, as well as generations of families and friends who feel passionate about the programs they watch on Iowa PBS, and by OPN Architects.
There's always a discovery period, and whether that is really trying to find the documentation of the original building or doing your investigation, every building has a story and there's always a surprise.
East of downtown Cedar Rapids and set in one of the community's most serene neighborhoods lies a mansion of historic significance. A touchstone to multiple generations and multiple families that have all called Brucemore their home.
The estate was the home for 3 generations of Eastern Iowa leaders. It began in the 1880s with Mrs. Sinclair, followed by the Douglas family at the turn of the century, and then Howard and Margaret Hall from 1937 to 1981. The history of the site really parallels the growth, the economic growth, the cultural growth, the social growth of Iowa throughout the previous 2 centuries.
It's a story that begins with a meatpacking empire along the Cedar River in the late 1800s.
Thomas and Caroline Sinclair moved to Cedar Rapids, and Thomas set up one of the largest meatpacking plants in the world here in Cedar Rapids. Tragically, he died in an accident in his plant in 1881, and that left his widow Caroline with 6 children. She chose to build here in Cedar Rapids and built this home to raise their young children.
Brucemore truly began its journey in 1884 when Caroline Sinclair purchased these 10 acres of land east of downtown Cedar Rapids. She desired a remote retreat for her family, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. She conceived a grand Queen Anne-style mansion at the head of a long, sweeping great lawn at a late 1800s price tag of $55,000. Caroline Sinclair inhabited what was then called Fair Home for the better part of 2 decades before changing hands for the next chapter of this estate.
She traded homes in 1906 with George and Irene Douglas, a younger family. He heir to the Quaker Oats fortune and a businessman and entrepreneur in his own right. And the estate really flourished under the ownership of the Douglases. They turned it into a broader estate, a country estate. They added the gardens and the landscaping by O.C. Simons to include duck ponds and timber. And they used it as a place to raise their 3 daughters. Surrounding the Great Hall in the main entrance of the mansion, the Douglas family, Mrs. Douglas, had a mural painted around the frieze of the Great Hall. It depicts scenes from Wagner's Ring Cycle, and it tells the story of that opera in little vignettes. Next to that mural is the Skinner player pipe organ that Mrs. Douglas installed in 1929. And it's notable that it's a player Skinner organ. It's a massive instrument. It runs 3 floors of the house, with the pipes being on the 3rd floor. But they had in their collection player rolls that could play the very opera that was being illustrated in the frieze.
The Douglas family rapidly expanded the greater estate of Brucemore. As a large garden was established. More than a century later, the gardens are still maintained for visitors, complete with walking paths and the same serenity the Douglas family experienced so long ago. All while resting in largely the same footprint as the original garden from the early 20th century. Throughout the Douglases' ownership, additional structures were built for staff quarters as the burgeoning estate spread throughout what would become a 26-acre property. The family's wealth was on full display, even as they were one of few Iowa families to be filmed with moving images in the early 1900s. Brucemore still owns the original film of an aristocratic family dressed up in front of one of the state's most famous homes. And more footage of friends and family gathering for a meal generations ago, when few Americans had their daily lives documented by moving images.
And then finally, when George died in 1923 and Irene died in 1937, she left the home to her eldest daughter, Margaret Douglas, who had married Howard Hall in 1924. So Howard Hall and Margaret Hall lived here for the balance of their lives.
The Douglas family's prized possession, Brucemore Mansion and grounds, would stay within the family for the next generation and introduce an historic modernization of both form and fashion. Howard Hall had married into the Douglas family and later became a full-time resident of Brucemore. But he kept the tradition of business ownership well into the 20th century. Hall and partners had a controlling interest in Iowa Steel and Iron Works, and later Iowa manufacturing. Hall's business boomed as Iowa roads required rock crushing in the 1920s. America needed steel workers during World War II, and a post-war effort to expand the federal highway system further fattened the company's bottom line. But Howard Hall and his wife Margaret Douglas Hall lived an extravagant, globe-trotting life and cherished their beloved Brucemore as they filled the estate grounds with German shepherds and a pet lion named Leo. He was a descendant of the famed MGM roaring lion of movie opening fame, making Leo an eccentric addition to Brucemore and one of the many aspects of the Hall's life documented with 23,000 feet of home movie film. Their beloved pets, including the lion, were buried on the estate, near statues of a German shepherd, and not far from nearby wildlife. Howard was known for brushes with the rich and famous, including appearing behind the scenes on the groundbreaking motion picture Gone with the Wind. One of the lasting legacies at Brucemore is what would be referred to today as a man cave. As you descend into the mansion's basement, you're enveloped by a lavish mid-century Tahitian theme, a contrast with the building's Queen Anne style.
But when you go into the basement, you're shifted immediately into that little time capsule. What's nice about that is that the house isn't frozen in any particular time. It's not frozen in one particular era. We can see examples of this change over time, and we can see evidence of the people who lived here. And it's important to point out that it's evidence of not only the owners, but of the staff, of the workers, the people who lived in the mansion or lived on the estate and made all of this lifestyle possible. So we spend a lot of time talking about their stories as well.
After a life lived as an Eastern Iowa business titan, Howard Hall would pass away in 1971. His wife, Margaret Douglas Hall, would follow 10 years later and donate the home and surrounding grounds for historic preservation.
All of the families really who lived here were intense philanthropic supporters of Eastern Iowa. They were industrial leaders, they were cultural leaders. And Mrs. Hall and Mr. Hall didn't have any children, and it was her wish that her estate, her family home, the place that she had lived since she was 11, that it be used for the benefit of Iowans. And so in her will, she left the ownership of the property to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a nonprofit organization in DC, owns 27 properties in the United States, and we're the only one in Iowa. So Brucemore Incorporated, the nonprofit local organization for which we work, operates and preserves the estate and co-stewardship with the National Trust, and we've been doing that since 1981.
Brucemore's story traces the early history of Iowa within the walls of a 21-room, 4-story Queen Anne-style mansion handed off between 3 sets of owners.
Mr. Sinclair, whose fortune paid for the mansion, immigrated to the United States from Ireland, came to Cedar Rapids because of the railroads finally connecting the Midwest to the East Coast. That's what started this economic development, and Brucemore is a result of that. And at every step of the way, shifting from meat processing to grains and agribusiness to heavy industry with Mr. Hall, our story parallels the economic growth of the region and of the state.
Today, Brucemore is known as a showcase for the arts, music, and theater, and the mansion is annually decorated for the holidays, both inside and out. A celebration of history, art, architecture, and sprawling beauty, all dating back more than a century. Tucked into the streets of downtown Cedar Rapids rests a hall of extravagance, history, and cultural significance. The Paramount Theater, one of Iowa's grandest halls, has been a gathering spot for nearly a century.
It was the grandest of them all. It was the biggest house in Cedar Rapids, and it was meant for, just that elegance, the colors in throughout the theater, just those golds and those reds, those vibrant colors. Paramount Theater opened in September 1st of 1928 as the Capitol Theater. It was the host to, even back then, all of the road shows, the comedians or the traveling performers. The Paramount's always been kind of more of what we'd consider the road show house.
The grandiose hall was built in a 1920s era of extravagant buildings meant to showcase arts and entertainment to a growing citizenry, including the burgeoning industry of motion pictures.
Just over a year later, Paramount Pictures actually came in and purchased the building. So it's been the Paramount Theater since 1929. Obviously with Paramount Pictures, the focus changed very much into a movie theater. It was the main focus for the building through the 70s was to play motion pictures.
Today, the Paramount is one of only 300 movie palaces left in the United States, and the Cedar Rapids locale is listed on the National Register of Historic Places.
I always joke with kind of the kids groups that come in, because for 50 years, this is where you came to just watch a movie. And when I think of the kids going to a movie now, when they're going to the latest Trolls movie or whatever it may be, and they're in their t-shirts and dirty shorts, where people would come to a movie here and it was top hats and ball gowns and just a completely different atmosphere and feeling that you would come for date night at the Paramount back in the 50s and 60s even.
In the 1970s, the aging theater was gifted to the city of Cedar Rapids, and fund drives were started to renovate the structure.
And then roughly in mid-70s, the building was purchased by the city, essentially kind of gifted to the city. Then it became the home of Orchestra Iowa and kind of turned it back into its original concept, where we are hosting Broadway productions.
More renovations were undertaken in the early 2000s, but nothing would compare to the challenges that came next, the historic Iowa floods of 2008. The nearby Cedar River crested well over the flood stage in summer 2008, overwhelming levees and flowing into downtown Cedar Rapids. Only blocks from the Cedar River, the Paramount Theater was inundated by floodwater, its main hall filled with muck and debris, with water damage seeping into the historic architecture.
The 2008 flood completely devastated this building. We're sitting on the stage here. We had 10 foot of floodwater where we sit, 8 foot of floodwater on the main floor, the main entrance, the Hall of Mirrors. These first row of seats behind me, you're talking 13 foot of floodwater. So really completely devastated the building.
All told, repairs would cost more than $16 million at Paramount Theater alone. The city of Cedar Rapids assembled a dedicated team to start a litany of objectives: restore the facility to operational condition, enhance the patron experience and the stagehouse function, minimize impact of future flooding on the structure, and respect the Paramount's historic integrity. A tall task for city decision-makers that could have opted to tear down a 1920s building and start fresh.
If you walked in today, it really doesn't look any different than it did in the 60s, in the 70s. And, the city, I absolutely commend what they did to not just abandon the Paramount go build a super fancy modern, because what they spent on the Paramount, you probably could, build a pretty fancy modern theater, but you could never rebuild a Paramount Theater like this. You could never, that grandeur.
During the repairs, experts analyzed the color and composition of historic paint and plaster to formulate new finishes utilizing an original color scheme. After discovering small sections of the Paramount's 1920s carpet, designers crafted new material to mimic the pattern and color scheme of the original.
They found a piece of carpet that was wrapped around a steel beam up in the attic, and they took that carpet and they cleaned it up and they analyzed it to get the exact pattern that was on there. It's essentially like a cream-colored carpet that they dye and stain in that fabric. The seats, there was a lady that had a pillow that was made out of the original seat fabric, so they were able to take that and get that exact same leafing. And so tons of different little components that they went into to rebuild the Paramount. But we have all new seats, and the seat configuration is completely different. There's more hip room and more leg room. So all of the seats on the main floor have come up to modern day standards. In the 1920s, we were all much smaller folk.
Today, the Paramount is better than ever before. Its back hallway filled with the signatures of touring acts that have visited the renovated structure. Some passageways still contain the historic artifacts and equipment from the early 20th century that brought life and movies to Cedar Rapids for the first time. The main entrance of Paramount is the Hall of Mirrors, modeled after a famous French icon and restored since the historic floods.
So the Hall of Mirrors is modeled after the Palace of Versailles in France. That's kind of what their inspiration was. From my understanding, the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles is like massive. It's just huge. So this is a much smaller scale, but it's essentially, half a block long. And it's just a really cool concept. There's three main chandeliers kind of in that mirrored space. When you look in the mirrors yourself, you see about 20 of yourself. So when you have that larger stained glass chandeliers up there, you just see hundreds of chandeliers as you kind of see the reflection. So it's just a really cool space.
Take a closer look at the smaller details of Paramount, and you may discover a Midwestern farm country touch.
Kind of the theme of the Paramount. If you zoom in on the seat fabrics or a lot of the details on the wall, it's very harvest theme. It's very Midwest. It couldn't be better suited. You'll see the faces. It's kind of the theme through the Paramount too, and we have kind of come to learn that is Ceres, the goddess of harvest.
As it nears its 100-year anniversary, the Paramount continues to draw from and entertain Iowa's second-largest community.
We've got 250,000 people kind of in our metro, which is not a big town at all. It's probably the biggest small town that I've been a part of. But because there's so many, I know this person, that small town kind of feeling that we are able to bring a lot of artists to Cedar Rapids because of our strong support that we have with people buying tickets and coming back to the Paramount.
At the southern edge of downtown Cedar Rapids rests the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library, a local crown jewel to anyone of Czechoslovakian heritage. But as visitors will quickly find, its modern inspiration rests right outside its doors in the Czech village. Still, without the Czech and Slovak people immigrating to the area, carrying their history and culture with them, neither the museum nor the Czech village would exist.
Czechs that came to America primarily settled in the Midwest, but a lot of them came to Ohio, they came to Chicago or Illinois, they came to Iowa, a lot came to Iowa. So the Czechs really kind of settled in the Midwest and down south, a little bit to Texas, a lot of them in Texas. The Slovaks, on the other hand, went to Pittsburgh, a lot in Pennsylvania overall. They went to Cleveland, a lot of them in Cleveland, and some went to Chicago. So you had a different sort of migration pattern, and so we are bringing it all together here.
Like all immigrants, the Czech and Slovak people were searching for a better life. With early 20th century Cedar Rapids offering practically boundless opportunities in farming and factory work, the Czech and Slovak people quickly recreated a bit of the old country in a young Iowa town with plenty of open space.
Well, I like to think of this part of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, as a bit of Central Europe because we have Czech Village, which one could call Old Town. We call that Staré náměstí. You can then go to New Town, which is Nubo, Nový náměstí. And usually the museum is at the center of the town. If you go to Prague and you're on St. Wenceslas Square, you see the National Museum right as you look down that big square. And when the Czech pioneers came here in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they envisioned a community of Czech settlers. So they came to Czech Village, and they had their own businesses, they had their own bank, they had everything. And because almost 30% of the population in Cedar Rapids in the early 1900s was Czech, these people came together and said, we need a place that will preserve the past, celebrate the present, and create the future. And thus we have our museum that we have today.
After 2 decades of grassroots organizing and volunteer efforts, the museum and library was opened and dedicated in 1995. With a ceremony featuring the sitting presidents of Czechia, Slovakia, and the United States. With visitors from across the nation, more than 10,000 people watched history be made as the museum opened its doors.
I always say we have 3 periods. We had our founding, we have the dedication, which was a joyous time, and we had this national phenomenon here in Cedar Rapids, but then the flood of 2008 came. And we found ourselves with 10 feet of water in the museum down below us here. And now we're on this, what I call 2020 phase, which is really expanding more nationally and internationally.
Following a long recovery effort, the museum was able to rebuild and prosper. But the immediate effects of the historic flood were devastating to the entire city.
It was really, I call it a 3-phased disaster. The building was affected, our artifacts were affected, and the people's spirits were challenged because not only did they have to deal with this museum, but what I spoke about, the Czech Village and Nubo area, that was all underwater, and many buildings were lost and many buildings were destroyed, and businesses.
We had a couple days lead time, fortunately, so we were able to act. We had a disaster plan, and so we used it.
As you walked into our grand hall, you saw the chandelier. The water was up to the chandelier. They were able to move out some materials, but everything else was pretty much underwater.
At that point, the museum was in the river. It was part of the river. So when we were able to get into it, many of the materials were caked in mud and rendered unusable.
So not only did we have to rebuild the museum and move it to higher ground, but the whole community had to rebound. And actually, it's, I think, become even bigger and stronger.
What began as a humble volunteer effort in the 1970s has blossomed into an internationally respected and professionally curated museum. While the nations of Czechia and Slovakia may have dissolved their joint boundary of Czechoslovakia in 1993, the culture of their people is still very much woven together. Their collective story and the journey to bring it to America is actually the first thing visitors encounter in the museum's permanent gallery.
As you walk in, the first thing you hear in our permanent gallery is the voices of freedom, which are the immigrant stories, the voices about their struggles, about their challenges, and about their successes of coming from either the Czech or Slovak Republic to America. And we have over 200 different recordings that you can hear throughout that exhibit.
From there, visitors can go as deep as they want into Czechoslovakian history, from the country's inception in World War I to its mutual separation with the Velvet Revolution in the 1980s and 90s. Beyond history, the gallery is home to some priceless artifacts, including a rare Tatra car, displays on traditional food and music, and an interactive immigrant experience where visitors are only allowed to pack a single suitcase before boarding an ocean liner to the United States. But perhaps the most celebrated exhibit is the showcase of traditional Czech and Slovak kroy.
We have probably one of the largest artifact collections of kroy in the country. Kroy is what we traditionally wear for celebrations, and in olden days they wore it to church, and so we have a revolving exhibit of kroy, which changes throughout the year. And we really encourage people to make sure if they're cleaning out their parents' or their grandparents' or great-grandparents' homes, we want you to contact us so that we can continue to build our collection.
In total, the museum has 4 galleries with 3 rotating exhibits throughout the year. But for serious historians and students, the library may be the facility's main draw. Since the Czech Heritage Foundation formed in 1974, the library has been considered paramount to its mission.
Those founders believed that not only culture and history is maintained in the form of artifacts and such, but also in the materials that they read and produced. So very early on, we have been collecting library-type materials in the form of books, periodicals, and non-book materials like photographs and letters, also phonograph records and sheet music and that sort of thing.
The museum and library is designed to give guests a full picture of Czech and Slovak history and heritage, be it in the galleries or library, and even the building itself.
The building was designed to be reminiscent, really, of Prague. When you go to Prague and you stand on Charles Bridge, you look around the city and you see all these red roofs. We have a red roof. And if you go outside, you'll see we have the clock tower, and that clock tower is very reminiscent to Prague. And with the steeples, and then the peaks. Certainly we added the steps after the flood, but very reminiscent of what you would see in Prague.
From the 2 neighborhoods, to the building, to all the materials available in the museum and library, people of Czech and Slovak descent will find affinity the moment they set foot in any part of the area. However, the museum and library curators are proud of how easily their content crosses over to general interests, enriching the lives of anyone who comes to visit.
We tend, to offer exhibits that certainly have Czech or Slovak content, but are more, universal in their themes. We do have a very specific Czech and Slovak focus, though there are topics that are broader, such as, like World War I or World War II, the communist era.
I see a lot of younger generations that forget their culture, and it's so important that we connect no matter what your culture is, and that's what we hope happens here, that you don't have to be Czech or Slovak to come here, but we hope that by coming here it will connect you to your culture.
As you drive Interstate 380 through Cedar Rapids, there is one monument that immediately grabs the eye: the Veterans Memorial Building, Eternal Flame. As your mind ponders its origin and significance, you might miss its equally curious foundation, a massive Beaux Arts structure resting on an island in the middle of the Cedar River. This 100-year-old 8-story Goliath is more than an eye-catching wonder, with its interior as intriguing as its exterior. The Veterans Memorial is a literal linchpin in local history, from its origin to its indelible stories, to the flame shining above. All together, they unfold many chapters in Cedar Rapids history.
I really don't know if there's anything else like this. In 1925, when the funds were available to build a memorial structure in the United States such as this, there were two towns separated by the river. One was Cedar Rapids and one was Kingston. And Kingston was being annexed into Cedar Rapids, and there was some bad feelings about that. So to bring all sides together, they wanted the central location for City Hall where people would come to do their business, celebrate, have a community event. So our address, in fact, is 50 2nd Avenue Bridge.
The push to erect the building began in 1920 when Civil War, Spanish-American War, and World War I veterans banded together, lobbying state and local officials for the structure. With a special measure written into the Iowa Code, military memorial structures could only be established through a special election. So in 1925, voters passed a measure issuing a bond to start the construction, making it the first memorial building in the state and making Cedar Rapids just the third city in the world to have its city hall resting on an island.
Such an iconic time when it was built, and they certainly don't build these like this anymore. The architecture is amazing on the inside and very striking on the outside. It's memorable. In 1925, 26, 27, the flame was not there yet. So if you can visually take the flame away and look closely down, you will see a replica of the tomb of the unknown soldier. There are no remains atop. However, it does really evoke that reverence and memorial to our veteran who have passed.
The Veterans Memorial Building is massive. Measuring 8 stories, the facility includes an iconic stained glass window, a large basement, a picturesque ballroom, as well as several offices and gathering spaces where governmental services and nonprofits work. But without question, the showstopper is the 2-story Coliseum Ballroom.
The only word I can think of is awesome. When you walk in here, the space and the acoustics and just being in such a large historical venue. For instance, we know Johnny Cash played on that stage. Fats Domino played on that stage. The Byrds. This was it. This was creme de la creme for Cedar Rapids back in the day. It's really exciting.
The Coliseum is also lined with history, from the original 1920s stadium seating to the refinished maple flooring. Also, during federal holidays or veterans events, the rafters commonly display 7 flags representing different military organizations, as well as 7 American flags. An inspiring sight, whether in use or standing idle, the Coliseum is but one of the historic spaces available for public use.
So when I give tours of the building, especially for facility rentals, I explain our 3 rental spaces as small, medium, and large. Small being the ballroom, which overlooks I-380 and the river. So it's gorgeous and historic. Nowadays, we find our bridal parties really prefer to have the ceremony up there and have an event in either the Coliseum or the Armory. So the Armory, I call that our medium space. The soldiers who enlisted from 1927 right up until about World War II would come here, get outfitted, do some drills, and then they got their orders shipped out to Fort Des Moines or Camp Dodge for further instruction.
As incredible as the spaces of the Memorial Union are, they may not even be the biggest draws for visitors. Resting just below the Civil War song inscription on the south entrance to the building is a one-of-a-kind stained glass window created by none other than Grant Wood. Well before he assembled the 9,000 glass pieces into a 20 by 24-foot mural, a call was put out in 1926 for an artist interested in creating a memorial window. Wood knew immediately he was the only person who should create the stained glass artwork.
Grant Wood was a World War I veteran himself, and he was part of the American Legion. So he knew about the funds available for a memorial art piece for the veterans of Cedar Rapids. And he wrote this really charming letter to the commission about how he is basically the best artist for the job. He is a local man, he is a World War I veteran, and the latter means the most because he can depict this the best. There's a lot of symbolism in the memorial window. A middle figure, she is to represent the Republic or America. She is floating over 6 soldiers from the great wars that America had fought in so far. So it's the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, Civil War, Spanish-American War, and World War I. Our Republic, also referred to as the Lady of Peace, she is holding a palm branch of peace and a laurel wreath of victory. If you look at the horseshoe, I call it, around the window, there are insignia of the branches of the military that was active at that time, so that's not to be missed. It's very special.
Following the Grant Wood Memorial window's placement in 1928, the Veterans Memorial Building was completed. For the next 80 years, the building saw uninterrupted use for city events, concerts, galas, military usage, tours, weddings, and much more. But come the historic floods of 2008, just as the rising waters took its toll on the rest of the city, the Veterans Memorial Building incurred a great amount of damage.
When the river peaked, June 13th, 2008, everyone had been evacuated from the building and could not get back in. So that was all of City Hall. Everyone was evacuated and couldn't get back in, so things were sitting here rotting. With the heat and the humidity and the water, it was epic. All of this was underwater.
Rising to more than 31 feet, the Cedar River subsumed the entire basement of the Veterans Memorial Building, with 14 inches of water rushing across the Coliseum floor and into the memorial window lobby. Eventually, the water receded, but the damage was done. Walls rotted, the maple floor was ruined, and while Grant Wood's window was untouched by the water, the atmospheric changes shocked the glass, cracking more than 150 pieces in the historic artwork.
What we're finding out now is that the building was built to be wet. There's certain areas that take on water, it comes up and it recedes. And those are our normal water events. In 2008, it was epic.
Like much of the city, the Veterans Building recovered and repaired. However, the devastation of the flood gave the city pause about housing all of its offices in one flood-prone building.
So think of this. The city grew 1925 to 2008. The city starts to fill every nook and cranny in the building because the city's growing, but the island doesn't grow. The building doesn't grow. So we do have 2 city departments here right now, the Civil Rights Commission and the Veterans Memorial Commission. All the other city departments for now are in New City Hall and spread out throughout the Cedar Rapids, which really makes sense for all the services that we provide today.
Still, there has been one relatively new addition that has sparked interest. Placed at the peak of the South Tower in the year 2000, the Eternal Flame is a recreation of the Statue of Liberty's torch, and for years the flame had been something of a local legend. That is until it became a cherished monument.
It was inspired by a Boy Scout project from the 1950s. Scouts wanted to see an eternal flame on the Veterans Memorial Building, and so they rigged up a steam pipe that flickered light that looked like a flame, and people in Cedar Rapids loved it. They remembered it all through those decades up to the point in 2000 when the commission had a permanent one installed.
While relatively new to the facility, the flame represents nearly a century of history flowing through the Veterans Memorial Building, and many Iowans have their own memories that connect them to this historic building.
One time, I was giving a tour, and one of the visitors piped up and said, "Well, I saw Johnny Cash here." And then I just about fell over. Like, "Do you have tickets? Do you have any memorabilia?" Just her memories. And that's really it, the memories of this building carry on.
In downtown Cedar Rapids rests the artistic embodiment of the city's past and present. A museum of art honoring contemporary ideas alongside work from hometown icon Grant Wood. Fused together much like the structure's original library was melded with a more modern wing. It all began with the Cedar Rapids Library and funds from the enormous wealth of American steel industrialist and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie.
The Cedar Rapids Museum of Art traces its origin back to 1895, when a group of civically minded individuals who had been to the Fine Arts Pavilion at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893 decided that Cedar Rapids needed an arts organization. It didn't have a home. They met in individual members' living rooms, and they discussed the various artists and architects of the day and previous. It didn't really have a home until 1905 when the Carnegie Library was built in town, and there was a space set aside specifically for the Cedar Rapids Art Association as we were then known. The Carnegie was occupied by the library until 1985, and so it was in continuous use from the time it was built in 1905 to 1985, and then it sat vacant for just a couple of years, maybe even not that long before discussions began about what to do with it. And people loved the building. It was a part of everyone's collective history. It was a place where you would get books, but it was also sort of a community center at the same time. And so having been a resident of the Carnegie Library, it made sense that the city leaders decided to approach the Cedar Rapids Art Museum to see if we would move back into the facility. It's one of the larger Carnegie libraries in the country, and this was due in part due to some negotiations that early city leaders had with Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was building libraries all over the country, and for many people who know Carnegie libraries, they tend to be on the small, cozy side. And so when we struck a deal with Carnegie for the library here in Cedar Rapids, the city leaders decided that they wanted to have a grand Carnegie Library. If they were going to do a library, they were going to do it right. So they actually went back to Andrew Carnegie and asked if he would double his commitment, because whatever Carnegie gave had to be matched by the city. And so the city was flush. This was sort of a heyday of some of our early agro-processing years here in Cedar Rapids, and so there was plenty of money to go around, and they had great civic pride.
When the Cedar Rapids Library moved to a new building in the 1980s, the Museum of Art continued to fill the structure, utilizing a combination of renovation and expansion, with a new 42,000 square foot addition designed by Charles Moore.
And he creates a space in between the two buildings, which is our atrium, which is the place where you enter from both 2nd Avenue or 3rd Avenue. And it is a zone that links the new building to the old building. And in that zone, you will see all kinds of modern references to classical architecture that you find in the Carnegie Library.
The works of famed Iowan and Cedar Rapids native Grant Wood are featured prominently inside the museum's more modern wing, blazing a path through Wood's early career into more iconic pieces.
In the one gallery display that we have on view, we do have work from all different moments in his history. The gallery is fairly porous, meaning that there are several entry and exit ways. So telling a linear story is a little bit difficult. But yeah, we work with the building, with Charles Moore's design, to try and tell that linear story so that visitors can see the progression of work. We don't have any of the very, very early works, the things that he did as a child or that he did in high school on view currently, because those are mostly works on paper and they can only be out for a limited period of time.
Grant Wood would garner international fame for work such as American Gothic, but the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art showcases his journey through early paintings of homes to the portraits of close friends and family.
A work that he worked on both in 1928 and again in 1930. It's a portraiture with very, very firm edges. The older gentleman is sitting in front of a map of Lynn County, an attribute, really, of his dominion, if you will. He was very influential. He was the father of his patron, David Turner, who the Turners owned the mortuary that Grant Wood was living adjacent to. In 1929, he paints a portrait of his mother, Woman with Plants. And in that, you see a combination of some painterly work that you see mostly in the face and hands, and then the firmer, more hard-edged work that you see in the clothing and in the landscape behind.
The museum also houses other Grant Wood creations, including woodwork and an item transformed from its original use in a mortuary.
We have work that he viewed that he did while he was a teacher at McKinley High School, and that he did with students, a mourner's bench that you would sit on outside the principal's office while you waited to be called into the principal's office for some wrongdoing that you might have done. He worked on that with the students. Has 3 finials. Each one is a small child's head grimacing or weeping because this is not the bench you wanted to sit on if you could avoid it. We have the actual door from the Grant Wood studio on view. And that was a door that was a modified coffin lid because the studio was adjacent to a mortuary, to a funeral home. And so it was a space that was offered to him by the managers, the owners of the funeral home, his workspace above the garage, basically. And so people in the Cedar Rapids felt very friendly with Grant Wood, felt very much that they could walk into his place anytime that they wanted to. So he fashioned a door that had a glass window in it, and it was a coffin lid that the glass was where you would look down into the coffin and see the deceased, as was the case then. And he fashioned a dial in that window that he could turn to let people know whether he was in or out, if he was out of town, if he was taking a bath, if he was away, what time he would return, if he was having a party. It really betrays his sense of humor.
Under the ownership of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art is the inner sanctum of Wood's creativity. His artist studio, still located near downtown. The modest loft space was converted into part studio and part living quarters. Much of its existence today in the 21st century resembles Wood's time 100 years ago. But the space began as a hayloft in the early 1900s.
He started using it as a studio in 1924, but realized right away, if he was clever about this, if he was ingenious about utilizing the space, he could actually live in the hayloft and move his mother in with him and sometimes his sister, and they could live and he could work in that same space, thereby not needing to pay to live someplace else, and also allowing him to become a full-time artist, to give up his teaching position and try to be a full-time artist.
From Grant Wood's real-life studio to the collection at the museum, these works resemble more than the efforts of one man. They are a celebration of the city's artistic history.
The Cedar Rapids Museum of Art has never had great funds to buy work. In fact, the collection here is somewhere between 90 and 95% donated to us. So in that way, the collection reflects the community.
In Iowa's second largest community, this collection of structures tell a story dating back more than a century. From a towering icon honoring veterans, adorned with a golden flame, at the Veterans Memorial Building, to an historic mansion known as Brucemore, with its multi-generational story of business titans and preservation. The legendary Paramount Theater, rebuilt to its original glory, even after it was ravaged by floodwaters. To a museum chronicling the rich immigrant heritage of the Czech people. Or the hometown work of an iconic American artist, Grant Wood, at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And an historic Louis Sullivan Bank finding new purposes in the 21st century. These Cedar Rapids structures combine for an unparalleled tour of awe-inspiring art and architecture, and make up just the latest chapter of historic buildings of Iowa.
Funding for Historic Buildings of Iowa, Cedar Rapids is provided by Friends, the Iowa PBS Foundation, as well as generations of families and friends who feel passionate about the programs they watch on Iowa PBS, and by OPN Architects.
There's always a discovery period, and whether that is really trying to find the documentation of the original building or doing your investigation, every building has a story and there's always a surprise.